Is Carrefour worth investing in? That is the question I am going to answer for you today. First of all, I am going to discuss some financial ratios, such as the current ratio, the debt ratio, and the return on equity. Secondly, I am going to look into the stock market of Carrefour. And lastly, I will share my conclusion. Firstly, I am going to discuss the current ratio, which is a liquidity ratio. This ratio shows if a company can pay their short-term obligations. A company is considered liquid if the current ratio is greater than 1. As you can see on the graph, Carrefour does not meet this requirement. As a result, this means that the company won't be able to meet its short-term obligations if they were all due at once. So in other words, the company's debts are greater than their assets, which isn't a good sign. Secondly, I am going to look at the debt ratio, which is a solvency ratio. This ratio indicates the extent to which total assets are financed by debt. The smaller the debt ratio, the better, because it means that a smaller portion of the total assets is made up of debt capital. Ideally, this ratio should be smaller than 1, because then a greater portion of a company assets is funded by equity, which is healthier for the company. In the case of Carrefour, their debt ratio was a little bit greater than 1 in 2019 and 2020, but in 2021 it was smaller than 1, so overall their debt ratio is good. The last ratio I will be looking into is the return on equity, which is a profitability ratio. This ratio indicates the return realized on the equity invested before or after tax. In other words, it measures the company's net income in relation to its shareholders' equity. A return on equity ratio that is lower than 10% is considered poor. If you look at the return on equity of Carrefour, we can see that it is only slightly greater than 10 in 2021. Although it has increased drastically over the past 3 years, the ratio is still considered low. Thus, Carrefour doesn't score well in terms of return on equity. Now I am going to investigate the stock market of Carrefour. If you look at the graph from the last year, we can see that it reached its peak around April and May, but then declined very sharply. You can see that the graph reached rock bottom around September and October. The stock market of Carrefour today is still pretty low. What could be the reason for this sharp decline? That is why I want to take a moment to reflect on today's economic situation. Mostly because of the war between Russia and Ukraine, prices have risen drastically in recent months. As a result, people are becoming more conscious of their money and prefer cheaper alternatives, such as Aldi and Lidl, for example. This competition may be a reason why there is less investment in more expensive supermarkets, such as Carrefour. With this drop in the share price, we can conclude that there are more providers than demanders. This is a bad sign for investors. To conclude, we saw that Carrefour didn't score well on most financial ratios. We could also see from the stock market that it is not a good idea to invest in Carrefour at this moment. Lastly, these are my sources, and thank you for listening.